Hey guys, it's Ross here. I'm back. Today we're going to speak about sustainability and its effects on the construction industry. I have Roger Barkley with me. Unfortunately, Ilya again wasn't able to make it. She's away on that super secret mission we all talked about, but no one knows about. And today we're going to talk about sustainability and its effects on construction. Sustainability being a extremely big word, I guess. We've kind of structured this conversation around sustainability in general, where we talk about sustainability and what that encompasses within the construction industry. We're going to talk a little bit about certification versus carbon reduction.
Possibly circular economy.
Circular economy might fit in there. Excellent. And then we're going to talk a little bit about who's involved within the construction process, who's involved within sustainability, and who takes the lead. And that will really depend on what we mean when we talk about sustainability, I would say. But Roger, first of all, bit of an introduction to who you are and what you're doing and all of that good stuff.
Yep, I am Roger. I work for KOSMOS and I am a specialist in sort of the more obscure or new areas of marketplaces where there's like room to grow, openings in the market, so to speak.
So looking at the likes of embodied carbon, for example, in our previous podcast, and prior to that, the specializations around cost modeling and I guess data and data analytics. But let's come back to sustainability. Sustainability is the new black, I guess, within construction. It's the buzzword. It's been around now for, well, I guess a number of decades, but people aren't taking it seriously or haven't been until the last 6 years, 5 years, 10 years. How would you put that?
It's been around historically a lot longer, and there's a couple of different ways to look at this, but the easiest way is most people have heard of like the Paris Accords. That's 2016. Older people will remember Kyoto, which is 1997. And the really old fogies like me will remember the Earth Summit in Rio. That's 1992. So if you go back to 1992, kind of sustainability and that whole thing takes off from that kind of point forward. So for example, LEED, which is the most internationally recognized green certification, that starts off in around 1993, 1994. DGNB, which is very popular in this part of Europe. They only started in, I think, 2007. And what's happened, sustainability is this thing that's kind of morphed over time. So what was discussed at Rio versus what is discussed at Kyoto, what is discussed at Paris, slightly different each time. You also have to kind of take into effect the IPCC, I always go to say interplanetary, but it's the International Panel on Climate Change. They've done 6 reports over the years. Number 5 is the part that's really most people might have heard of, which is the part that's kind of centered around what happened in Paris. They recently, a year or two ago, brought out a 6th edition, which has got some scary stuff in it. So that's kind of the history, but sustainability, I think as we mentioned in the last episode, there was a capitalistic motivation behind it to start off with. You could easily sell it because if you're creating more energy efficient buildings, there was a financial case for it because after say 15 years or something, it's paid for itself and now you're making a saving. So over long term, you're making saving. And as the technology gets better, like with lighting's always a good example, the business case gets better and better and better. And it being green back in like the very early 90s was almost like this. And at the same time, guys, you're doing something good for the environment.
Yeah, I don't think that message has gone away yet, actually, because we're still stamping that, with certification, etc., on our buildings, right? We're not really looking at the complexities around it. But sustainability within construction, we talked a little bit on our previous episode on embodied carbon and sustainability strategies. We when we come onto projects, we see them on project sustainability strategies, and I often look at them and think that they're a little bit muddled or not very clear in terms of how that's structured. For me, and maybe you contradict me here a little bit, sustainability for me is kind of, it has three kind of siloed structures for me. One is certification and what needs to be done on the project in order to achieve that certification, whether it is BREEAM, LEED or DGNB. The next one is sustainability in terms of architecture and design, and that might run into your operation, for example. Engineering is not just architecture and design, it's also engineering. And in the third layer or third silo for me then is embodied carbon. And that's how I try to look at sustainability when people talk about it in construction. And those three silos or aspects are very, very different from each other, albeit they are very much connected, I would say. So would you agree with that, or would you disagree? Is there anything you could add to that or say?
I would say sustainability, one of the reasons people have a problem with it is it's become a very broad, far-reaching thing to start off with. So you can get all the way into things like acid rain, you can get into biodiversity. We talked before about like the spheres, like what people in the construction industry in general know, what the specialists know, what private institutions like green certifications, and what governmental bodies, and then the universities. Even what's happening within those departments, the institutional ones, private and public, has morphed over time to encapsulate things to more things. So if you look at the point scoring system, say for LEED or DGNB, you'll see this broad, we want to cover everything, we want to do. But what's kind of happening now is the focus is really far more towards carbon. So if you look, for example, at EU taxonomy, there's 6 different categories that they've created, but the one is pretty clear from when they launched them, because they put 2 out ahead of the other 4. What they really were focusing on was the carbon management and carbon adaptation. And the same is true with Paris. Paris kind of like, if you look at that history again, like what happens with Rio, what happens with Kyoto, it starts coming towards carbon, carbon, carbon. And then now kind of sneaking in at the edges as it changes over time, circular economies starting to work its way in there as well. So not just the different aspects of recycling, the different types of recycled product.
I just had a comment in relation to that. So if Paris and the Paris Agreement is narrowing its focus down towards carbon, and EU taxonomy as well is narrowing its focus down towards carbon, but our certifications like LEED and BREEAM and DGNB and so on are only have a very small focus on carbon. Like an example would be you get a number of credits if you do an LCA, a life cycle assessment, right?
Yeah. It depends who you're dealing with, and you get some interesting answers from them. Because some of the comments that are going out there is, shouldn't you have a bigger focus on embodied carbon? And the reason that creeps in is because there's a bit of a flaw in some of the systems. Historically, they focused on energy efficiency, which in whole life carbon is B6, it's operational energy. Well, imagine if this has been going on for a couple of decades now, say that through those approaches, you halved how much energy you required, then you halved it again. It's the law of diminishing returns. But at the same time, governments are moving towards changing their grids towards clean energy. So it's almost one of the strings I mentioned before in the ball of wool in the can being kicked down the road is the green certifications aren't necessarily adapting quick enough.
So LEED certifications, not LEED, but certifications in general, if we talk about them just a little bit, it's part of our structure, our schedule anyway, certifications versus carbon reduction, carbon calculation. So certifications, what we're saying right now really for certifications is that they're potentially outdated a little bit if they're connected with EU taxonomy and the Paris Agreement.
They are in danger of falling behind, because if you take, not picking on LEED, but it's been around the longest, it's got the most reach internationally. I think they've only just recently updated, and even in the update, I think of a 70-point scoring system, you get 3 points only for embodied carbon. One is just for doing the LCA calculation, which means you're only getting a maximum of 2 points for actually reducing the amount of embodied carbon, maximum of 2 points. So the arguments and this is where it's important to maybe bring it out, because you as a private individual, whether you're a big building owner or whether you're a big firm of architects, it's hard to try and push some of these private institutions to upgrade. It needs a wider audience kind of saying, "Ooh, isn't there a bit of a problem here?" Like someone holding up a flag, and that flag is operational energy's relevance is decreasing because over time it's coming law of diminishing returns, because, okay, we start off, say, in the early 90s and we've made buildings more energy efficient by 50%, then 50% again, then 50% again, law of diminishing returns. But also as we move to green energy, it's going towards zero anyway. And we're not moving. So when you look at the percentage shift between embodied carbon and operational carbon's going down and the percentage of embodied's going up. But the point scoring,
it's still 3. 2, because you can just run your LCA and away you go.
And that doesn't even, their particular approach doesn't even touch on benchmarking. It's just, I will give you points if you reduce the carbon in your building by 5 or 10%.
Yeah, but from where?
Exactly. So say you're a building owner and you've just got, in whatever certification, platinum. You spent all that money, you've done the ribbon cutting, everyone's so happy, and you ask the question, so you assume that that building that's got the highest achievement is now in line with Paris. Not necessarily so, because nobody is benchmarking against it. Because when we talk about these dates about 2030, 2050, the 2030 date is to do with a carbon budget. We are only allowed, in theory, to have X amount of CO2e in the atmosphere at that point in time. And then we have to do certain things if we're going to achieve a 1.5, 2 degree centigrade world. And part of what some people like Copenhagen Consensus have kind of noticed is, well, if we had all this time and we could have been steadily ramping down, we've consumed too much of that budget. And the IPCC 6 is disturbing because of the fact that they're not kind of predicting 2 circumstances now. It's almost like they've said,
this is the only way out, basically.
No, they've kind of said that they've acknowledged that globally there's too many factors that just aren't coordinating or moving in the way that they should be. So they've had to come up with 6 potential scenarios. So there's the 6 potential scenarios of how it could go, because they just can't condense it into just it's this or it's that.
So if we come back then to sustainability as an overarching in construction, it's very, very broad is what we're saying right now. And it sounds like it's a little disconnected from the reality on the ground, being certification, versus the reality within Europe and the Paris Agreement, which will eventually potentially become a problem for our industry. But we're investing quite heavily at the moment in certifications and increasing those certifications, potentially against, well, false hope, I would say, to a certain degree.
Yeah, it's almost like not turning a blind eye. They've acknowledged there's something that needs to be done. It's like each institution has its own vision, and there's nothing wrong with the vision. Biodiversity, cleaner water, cleaner air, these are all fantastic things to go towards, but there are some things that are emergency and they're being kicked down the road, which means that solutions that have to be taken later on are going to be more severe. So when we talked about Denmark bringing in the regulation saying that you have to do an LCA calculation and hit a benchmark, and that benchmark will move every so many years. This is on the scale of what you would call soft to hard measures. So soft measures is, come on guys, we're going to do something, do it because it's good, show you're a good guy. The hard measures are like, they normally creep in with something like taxation. So sort of like, I will start to tax you because you're doing something I don't like. The real hard measure tends to be when I hit you with legislation. You have to do it because I say so. This coming in, it's a hard measure with a soft start, because what they've done is they've tried to calculate what they think is the current case for buildings and set a reasonably small increment down. But then if you look at the increments of the years going forward, you can see they get stronger. And this is where the ticking time bomb of cost is potentially coming in.
So Denmark are really leading the way in terms of this legislation and government saying, no, we now need to do this as part of our global sustainability, carbon reduction, and to prevent global warming. What you're saying is that potentially in the coming years, Europe will bring that in as a European legislation, meaning all European countries will have to follow this. Now, that's going to be very difficult for countries. I would argue that Denmark is absolute leader in this and have been for quite some time. Sustainability has been in the front of everywhere you go for almost the last 6 to 8 years or more. The UN sustainability goals have been advertised in Denmark, probably because the UN's headquarters are here, but nevertheless everywhere for many, many years. But some countries are doing nothing. So what's going to happen here? I know we're digressing slightly, but it's a very interesting topic because it's going to affect all of us, no matter where we are located in the world and within the construction industry.
Well, and this is where one of the contentious things kind of comes in again. It's not just developing nations, it's developed nations not necessarily wanting to do what they said they were going to do. Or another example is developing nations. So if you take Vietnam, for example, their national grid is getting dirtier in terms of carbon because it's developing, it's easier to do coal and oil fired plant, and they are happy to go for renewables, but they're saying to the international community, we need financial assistance to do that. And until that financial system comes forward, they can't put the plan in place to start changing. So again, it's one of those things, sustainability, that's why I say this ball of string, and each string you pull out has a degree of nuance and problems on it.
So there's going to be big changes on this, and I think this is one of the reasons for discussion really in how it affects our industry, but also our profession as QSs. So on projects at the moment, and some of the projects we work on with the different stakeholder groups, it seems like that every stakeholder has some type of involvement or interest in sustainability consultancy, design, whatever the case may be. And I would agree that everybody does have a requirement to be involved, because if we look at those, again, three kind of silos within sustainability: certification, kind of design, whether it's architecture, construction, or services, and then carbon, we all have an involvement. Like in cost, we all have an involvement in cost. The decisions taken by the design team have a direct impact on cost. The decisions taken by the design team have a direct impact on carbon, have a direct impact on your certification. So the need now for more collaboration across sustainability is growing, and I think it seems to be the theme for our podcasts. We shouldn't call it Inventing Construction. We should just call it collaboration, I guess, right? We need to talk a little bit then about on the projects, about who is involved on this. So if we take kind of certification, that silo, what we're seeing at the moment today then is that you either have a sustainability specialist, either a consultant or out of the design team, whoever the client contracts with, that will come in and advise on that certification, whether it's LEED, BREEAM or DGNB. And they will drive the strategy around that. Part of that is your 3 points for...
Yeah, but that is based on their vision. So LEED's point scoring system has a vision. DGNB has a vision and then their way of interpreting it and pushing it. Each individual nation has its own vision and its way of pushing it. And they're not necessarily
aligned,
very well aligned or integrated. Or in the case of like Paris, are some things aligned at all? There's some things like the EU taxonomy that are potentially vehicles for trying to bring certain nations together and push them forward in the direction kind of more uniformly. But again, it's an issue of time. the real big point about kicking the can down the road is how big potentially the green premium could be.
And by green premium, you mean the additional costs associated with going green, right? This, whether it's the increase in certification, the drive to reduce embodied and operational carbon, whatever that case may be, that additional money that it's going to cost the developer investor to get as far as that green initiative. And this will become, as you mentioned, the challenge to the future now, I guess, as these harder elements come into play, like the policies we're now seeing.
When people like kind of ask us if I want to go for silver, gold, platinum, the first question that comes out is, what is the premium? And this has been very well researched, like all over the world, different universities of looking at different standards. And like at the lowest level, it's like a small percentage working upwards. But the thing that creeps out of it is that there are measures that you can take that are relatively cheap. But once you start running out of them, they get progressively expensive. Now, bear in mind that if the benchmark for carbon isn't uniform, it's going to keep going down how much carbon you can have. You cannot reduce a building's carbon to zero without offsetting. So you've got one set of problems in terms of, so if I'm going to buy more carbon efficient, say everybody goes like Denmark and suddenly, bang, now you've got to hit a benchmark. So now the demand for those materials goes
Those
up.
green materials like timber, green concrete, green steel, etc.
Is there enough supply and demand of that? The closer we get to 2030 and beyond, where to get under these increasingly smaller targets, how do we get down? Now you've got to get to offsetting this Section D stuff that's being pushed to one side and just like, yeah, give me those numbers, but I'm not going to factor them in right now.
One of the other strings in your ball of the can being kicked down the road.
They're part of the whole life carbon calculation. So at the moment, a realistic whole life carbon calculation is Section A, B, C. D, they'll accept it, but they don't really want to factor it in. But you can't get to net zero in the future without D. And D will involve sequestration and also carbon offsets. The problem with carbon offsets, again, is going to be supply and demand. And there's a number of these string issues related to them, like there's long-term and there's short-term. There's some systems that aren't really real.
Give us an example of a carbon offset.
So, for example, I plant so many trees, I get a certificate for that equates to a credit. There's direct air capture, say, for example, where they take it out of the atmosphere and then deposit in mines below ground, because some of these systems are long-term, like direct capture going into the ground, but trees might be intermediate terms. Say, for example, I grow hemp. Hemp takes a lot out of the atmosphere. I can actually put that into green products. It's one of the products that's most overlooked and shouldn't be. So I can get a carbon credit related to that, but it's short term. If I, for example, if all I do is grow it and then I let it die, it releases its carbon again. So there's term lengths for these technologies that take carbon out of the atmosphere.
But the carbon credits will become an issue in the future as well. If it's kind of, so as you mentioned, supply and demand, right now there's only a certain number of credits available to the industry as it is. So if the entire of Europe, for example, moves in the direction of Denmark, we're going to have a huge shortage of credits, meaning price is going to go up, meaning your capex for that particular building is also going to go up as you begin to strive towards green building, lower CO2 benchmarking requirements, as we just discussed, and the addition of your carbon credit requirement to your Section D, the full whole life cycle costing calculation.
And we aren't likely to all go at the same time, but then just look what happened with COVID inflation. People came out of lockdowns at different times, but it didn't matter. It still caused a huge inflation. So even if different countries go at different times, you're still going to have this problem with supply and demand imbalances. And particularly with the future technologies that's needed, there's a time period to get to having enough quantity there. at a right price, because some technologies are capable of doing something, but then they need to follow, I think it's Young's law, like with capacitors, where every decade the price of the capacitor dropped from $2.20 down to 2 cents, down to a whole packet for $2. It's the same thing. They've got to create something that works. There's a price attached to it. Then they've got to work on the technology to get it down to that sweet spot in terms of a price that people are willing to pay for it to be viable.
So what you're saying in terms of carbon credits. So hypothetically, if I had 100 acres in the west of Limerick, should I be kind of planting hemp right now?
Yeah, hemp's a very interesting one because everybody leaps on timber for its sequestration, but it takes such a long time to draw it, to reach its
capacity, if you like. Or
but hemp, it grows relatively quickly and you can fell it and then put it into products. So for example, there's hempcrete blocks.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. A lot of development in that sector.
And there's also a lot of, it doesn't necessarily relate to construction, but there's something called green fertilizer or green mulching, where instead of using chemical fertilizers, you can grow very fast growing crop that then is rotated into the ground. So it's consuming carbon, but then it deteriorates and then it gives nutrients into the soil.
Yeah.
So it's the same kind of thing. It's the time it takes for it to consume.
But bringing it back into sustainability in the construction industry, and it seems like what we're doing right now it's a starting point. It might be a bit disjointed from kind of where we need to get to. What we predict, or you're predicting, is that we will see big changes in the next kind of 7 years up to 2030 right now that will be quite serious within our industry.
At some point, people are going to start doing like Denmark, and we're going to move from soft to hard measures. We're going to start seeing benchmarks and then progressively tighter, just because of, if you look at the different scenarios out of the IPCC report and how much we might overshoot the carbon budget by, different nations are going to start, because Denmark has essentially just leaped. It's leaped a number of soft measures and gone to hard, and it's gone to quite a hard measure, but with a soft start. A lot of people might do that.
If under the circumstance that we don't reach 2030 and our target's 2030, I guess we're going to double down till 2050 then.
And the problem is that we might not be able to if the carbon removal measures aren't there. Because the problem is once the carbon's there, you've broke the limit. You're now out of the 2 degrees C world. You're now into one of the other scenarios. So the only other way to possibly escape that is to have carbon removal measures, and the technology and its predicted path and its quantity is just not there. But the other issue with this kicking the can along the road is, as we were kind of touching on, there's a premium now. It's what the premium is the further you kick it out, because of that whole issue of supply and demand and how far we have to cut our benchmarking by to get towards where we want to be.
It sounds like there's going to be big development in this sector over the next decade or 2 decades, right? Very interesting. So just to kind of recap on what we were looking at there, sustainability in its general sense across construction, potential 3 silos within certification, design and embodied carbon, or whole life carbon, the connection between what we're currently doing now, the Paris Agreement and EU taxonomy, and then the potential impact that sustainability is going to have on construction, not just for us as QSs, but actually for the industry as a whole, including investor developers, as we look at to the future about hitting these targets and these hard kind of elements of policies that are going to hit the industry over the next number of years. Hugely interesting.
The cost effect could have quite severe repercussions for the construction industry as a whole, because there is an example, it's not an exact one for one, but if you look at when LEED first came out, so if we just say now, when people say what's the green premium, say silver, it's like 2% or less, gold it's maybe 4 to 6, platinum it's maybe like 9, 10, 12%. When LEED first came out, and this was one of the interesting things the universities did that got overlooked, was there was a lack of products, but also kind of a lack of understanding in the marketplace. And what happened was when people are like mucking around in this new whole area, the green premium back then was something like 20-25%. On some projects it was like 40%, in some outliers 60%. So it's not a one-to-one example, but if we find ourselves suddenly in this environment with a lack of products, a lack of understanding,
without a slow build up,
I don't think it'll be a slow one, because the can's kicked so long that someone bites, and it goes exponentially, like compound effect. So that green, if you imagine a green premium hitting your project at a minimum 20%, of 20%,
yeah.
How many projects does that kill?
Yeah, your commercial projects are goosed. Like, yeah, it's very interesting. But I think that's all we have time for today, Roger. We could continue going, and maybe there's another session around this for sure, and sustainability, and maybe more in particular of actually the day-to-day workings on a project with that interconnectivity with other stakeholders. I think we need to get into that for our QS listeners so that they understand how they need to relate to architects and engineers when looking at carbon and sustainability and LEED certification. But thank you very much for today.
No problem.
Thanks very much for listening. There's a LinkedIn link below in the show notes. We would love to connect with you.
We hope you enjoyed it and have you with us in the next one. Thank you very much.